Carl Jung's final message about empaths will completely challenge everything you believe about your compassion. Jung discovered that the empath is essentially a child who was never permitted to be selfish. That intense urge to heal everyone, absorb their pain, and vanish in service of others, it's not a spiritual gift. It's survival programming from a childhood where your needs were too much, your emotions too loud, and your very existence contingent on caring for others. But here's what makes Jung's insight truly transformative. He didn't see empaths as broken. He viewed them as being part-way through what he called individuation, the psychological journey toward wholeness. Deep down, you've always sensed that your empathy came with a price you couldn't quite define. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Yet you've always felt that your true self was never allowed to emerge, that your authentic identity was sacrificed to keep others comfortable. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why your sensitivity feels like both a blessing and a burden. You'll recognize the psychological patterns that turned your natural empathy into a survival strategy. Most importantly, you'll discover Jung's path to what I call sacred selfishness, the healthy boundaries that transform empathy from compulsion into conscious choice. This doesn't mean becoming less caring. It means reclaiming the right to care for yourself with the same intensity you've always cared for others. Jung understood a truth about empathic development that many overlook. What we call empathy in adults often begins as emotional hypervigilance in childhood, a survival mechanism that arises when a child's safety depends on constantly monitoring the emotional state of their caregivers. Consider this pattern: the child who reads their parents' moods before they even speak, the little one who becomes the family emotional barometer, always sensing storms before they arrive, the child who learns that expressing their own needs causes tension but anticipating others' needs creates safety. Jung termed this premature ego adaptation. Children who develop advanced psychological skills out of necessity, not healthy growth, have nervous systems that function like seismographs for danger, tuned to every emotional tremor around them. This isn't conscious learning. It's adaptive wiring. Your brain literally rewired itself for survival in an unpredictable emotional environment. You gained what Jung called a psychological antenna, a remarkable ability to sense what others feel and need. But Jung also discovered the devastating cost of this adaptation: the suppression of what he called your authentic selfishness, the healthy self-love every child requires to build a strong sense of self. Jung wrote, "The healthy individual is able to love himself as much as he loves others." But the future empath learned the opposite. Love others more than yourself because your needs are dangerous. If you learned to read the room before you could read books, comment below. I was the family emotional detective. This creates what I call the empathic paradox. The very sensitivity that makes you attuned to others becomes the barrier that prevents you from knowing yourself. You become an expert in everyone else's inner world while remaining a stranger to your own. Jung recognized that this pattern, adaptive in childhood, becomes self-destructive in adulthood. The child who is never allowed to be selfish becomes the adult who struggles to advocate for themselves, set boundaries, or even recognize their own needs. Jung made a striking discovery about what lies in the unconscious of those with empathic patterns. In the shadow, the rejected parts of the psyche, he found not darkness, but what I call forbidden selfishness, the natural self-advocacy deemed unacceptable in childhood. Many empaths carry immense guilt about their shadow because it contains everything they were taught was wrong. Anger, boundaries, saying no, prioritizing themselves, having needs, demanding respect. Jung called this shadow formation through moral conditioning. Here's Jung's revolutionary insight: these selfish impulses aren't pathological. They are the missing pieces of a complete personality. The empath who never learned healthy selfishness becomes what Jung termed a wounded healer, someone who gives from emptiness rather than fullness. Jung observed that empaths often unconsciously resent their own compassion. They give endlessly, yet beneath it lies rage, exhaustion, and a part of them that wants to stop caring, to step away, to finally choose themselves. This isn't because they're bad people. It's because Jung's compensation principle is at work. The psyche strives to balance one-sided development by bringing the rejected qualities into consciousness. Consider what Jung called inentroia, the tendency for traits to turn into their opposite when pushed to extremes. The person who gives endlessly eventually becomes resentful. The one who never says no eventually explodes. The empath who denies their shadow becomes bitter. Jung recognized that integrating the shadow isn't about becoming selfish. It's about reclaiming the right to exist as a complete human being. The empath's shadow holds their sacred selfishness, the healthy ego strength necessary for authentic relationships. If you've ever felt guilty for prioritizing yourself, comment, "My needs feel selfish, but they're not wrong." Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." For empaths, this darkness isn't cruelty or narcissism. It's the radical, simple act of acknowledging that they matter as much as anyone else. Jung identified a distinct crisis in empathic psychological development, which he called the individuation imperative. It is the moment when the psyche demands that you become who you truly are, not who you learn to be for survival. This crisis often shows up as what I call empathic burnout, not mere fatigue, but deep soul exhaustion resulting from years of living inauthentically. Jung saw this as the psyche rebelling against continued self-abandonment. The signs Jung documented are unmistakable. You can no longer fake caring. Old motivations lose their power. Other people's problems feel heavy rather than meaningful. You begin to resent what once defined you, your readiness to help others. Jung interpreted this not as failure, but as psychological emergence. Your authentic self is striving to be born, and this requires dismantling the false self built around serving others. This is where Jung's concept of the transcendent function becomes vital. The transcendent function is the psyche's ability to reconcile opposites, in this case, the caring self and the self-caring self. It isn't about choosing between empathy and selfishness. It's about integrating both into what Jung called individuated wholeness. Jung observed that empaths in this crisis often feel like they are betraying everyone by changing. People say, "You're not the same person anymore," or "You've become selfish." Jung understood this as collective resistance to individual development. But Jung also discovered a crucial truth. The people who truly love you will support your individuation. Those who resist it were benefiting from your self-abandonment. He called this differentiation anxiety, the fear that setting healthy boundaries will jeopardize relationships. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." For empaths, this requires what he called developmental courage, the willingness to disappoint people who preferred you diminished. If you've been told you've changed since setting boundaries, comment, "I didn't change. I just stopped hiding." Jung saw this individuation crisis as a spiritual emergency, a demand from the soul for authenticity. The empath who answers this call doesn't become less caring. They become consciously caring rather than compulsively caring. Jung introduced the idea of sacred selfishness. This isn't narcissism. It is what he described as the ethical obligation to become yourself, recognizing that your first responsibility is to your own psychological growth. Jung wrote, "Your vision becomes clear when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." For empaths, looking inward often reveals years of self-neglect disguised as virtue. Conscious selfishness involves several key elements Jung identified as essential for psychological health. First, emotional sovereignty, the understanding that you are not responsible for managing others' emotions. Jung saw that taking on this responsibility actually hinders their psychological development. Second, boundary consciousness, the ability to recognize where you end and others begin. Jung called this ego boundary development and considered it crucial for individual health and authentic relationships. Third, need legitimacy, acknowledging that your needs are as valid as anyone else's. Jung observed that empaths frequently treat their own needs as optional while prioritizing others as mandatory. Jung discovered that empaths who cultivate sacred selfishness actually become more helpful, not less. They give from choice rather than compulsion, from fullness rather than emptiness, from strength rather than weakness. This creates what Jung called differentiated love, the capacity to care for others without losing yourself. You can feel compassion without absorbing pain, offer support without taking responsibility, and love without disappearing. Jung understood that the highest form of service arises from individuals who have undertaken their own psychological work. The person who has reclaimed their sacred selfishness offers the world their authentic presence rather than a people-pleasing performance. If you've realized that caring for yourself allows you to help others more effectively, comment, "I give from overflow, not emptiness." Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." For empaths, this means accepting the parts of themselves that desire recognition, rest, reciprocity, and respect, All the things they were once taught were selfish to want. Jung made a profound observation about what occurs in empathic relationships when sacred selfishness is embraced. He called it relational recalibration, the process by which relationships either deepen through mutual authenticity or dissolve because they were dependent on the empath's self-abandonment. Empaths who begin to set boundaries often discover something surprising. Many of their relationships were built on what Jung called projective identification. People were not relating to them as individuals, but as functions: the caretaker, the listener, the problem solver. Jung observed that when empaths stop fulfilling these functional roles, some people experience what I call supply withdrawal. They become angry, manipulative, or accusatory because their emotional needs are no longer automatically met. Yet Jung also documented something beautiful. The relationships that survive this transformation become what he called authentic encounters. Instead of one person giving and the other receiving, both meet as equals, each responsible for their own emotional well-being. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." True meeting, however, can only happen between individuated individuals, those who know where they end and others begin. This is why Jung emphasized that empaths must practice what I call relational selectivity. Not everyone deserves access to your empathy. Not every person who seeks help is ready to receive it. Not every familiar relationship is healthy. Jung understood that empaths often confuse intensity with intimacy, need with love, and drama with depth. Recognizing these distinctions requires developing what Jung called psychological discernment, the ability to see people as they are rather than as you wish them to be. The individuated empath attracts different people than the self-abandoning empath. They draw those who are also doing their own psychological work, rather than those seeking someone to carry it for them. Jung noted that this shift may feel lonely at first, as the empath breaks generational patterns of codependency, but it ultimately leads to what he called authentic belonging, relationships grounded in mutual respect rather than mutual need. If you've noticed that setting boundaries changed who stays in your life, comment, "I attracted my equals when I stopped accepting less." Jung's wisdom here is clear. You cannot have authentic relationships until you become an authentic person, and becoming authentic requires embracing your sacred selfishness. Jung's vision of psychological wholeness includes what I call the integrated empath, someone who has reclaimed their sensitivity as a conscious choice rather than an unconscious compulsion. This person represents Jung's ideal of individuation achieved. The integrated empath embodies what Jung called conscious empathy, the ability to feel with others without losing themselves. They have learned to use their sensitivity as a tool, rather than being used by it. Jung identified several characteristics of psychological integration particularly relevant for empaths. First, emotional choice, the capacity to decide when and how much to feel with others. Healthy empathy, Jung observed, has an on-off switch governed by conscious will rather than automatic response. Second, compassionate detachment, the ability to care without carrying. Jung noted that the most helpful people maintain what he called loving distance, close enough to assist, far enough to preserve perspective. Third, reciprocal relationships, connections where empathy flows both ways. Integrated empaths naturally attract people capable of giving in return, creating what Jung called mutual individuation. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." The integrated empath achieves this by recognizing that their truest self encompasses both their capacity for compassion and their right to self-preservation. This integration fosters what Jung called earned security, a deep inner stability independent of others' approval or emotional states. The integrated empath can witness others' pain without absorbing it, offer support without assuming responsibility, and love without losing themselves. Jung understood that this level of integration serves the collective good. Integrated empaths model healthy boundaries, authentic relationships, and conscious compassion. They demonstrate that sensitivity does not require self-destruction. The journey from unconscious empathy to conscious empathy is what Jung termed the hero's journey of the psyche. It demands facing the shadow, integrating opposites, and choosing wholeness over approval. If you've learned to help others without harming yourself, comment, "I'm a conscious empath now." Jung's final insight about empaths is this: sensitivity is a gift, but only when offered from choice rather than compulsion, from strength rather than weakness, and from wholeness rather than woundedness. Jung's most profound discovery about empath centers on what I call the freedom realization. The moment you realized that your empathy was never truly about others, it was about your attempt to feel safe in an unpredictable world. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." The empath's journey reveals that their hyper-responsibility for others was actually an effort to control their environment, to prevent the emotional chaos they experienced in childhood. This insight can be both liberating and frightening. It means recognizing that much of what you called love was actually psychological management. Unconscious strategies to keep others calm, happy, and stable so you could feel secure. But Jung discovered something freeing about this realization. Once you understand that your empathy was a survival strategy, you can choose to retain it or transform it. You are no longer driven by unconscious programming. You become what Jung called the author of your own psychological story. This freedom gives rise to what I call authentic empathy. Sensitivity that stems from love rather than fear, choice rather than compulsion, strength rather than vulnerability. The integrated empath feels with others because they want to, not because they have to. Jung observed that this transformation often triggers what he called existential guilt, the sense that you are betraying your essential nature by changing the inner voice that says, "But I've always been the helper," or "People depend on me," or "What if no one loves me if I'm not useful?" Jung understood this guilt as the final resistance of the false self built around serving others. He called it identity grief, mourning the version of yourself that was never real but felt familiar. Jung also described what he called the freedom paradox. The realization that having the choice to help actually makes helping more meaningful, not less. When empathy becomes voluntary rather than compulsive, it transforms from a burden into a gift. The truth Jung revealed is this: you were never meant to be an emotional caretaker for the world. You were meant to be a conscious individual who chooses when and how to offer your gifts. Your empathy was meant to be a superpower, not a burden. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." For empaths, this includes embracing the right to exist without constantly proving their worth through service to others. This acceptance creates what Jung called psychological sovereignty, the recognition that you are the ultimate authority over your own experience. No one else can dictate what you should feel, give, or be. Jung observed that empaths who achieve this sovereignty often go through what he called the reparenting phase, learning to give themselves the unconditional acceptance they never received as children. They learn to speak to themselves with kindness, prioritize their own needs, and celebrate their accomplishments. This internal reparenting is essential because, as Jung understood, you cannot give from emptiness indefinitely. The empath who nurtures themselves becomes capable of truly nurturing others. Jung also noted that achieving psychological sovereignty often involves grieving the unlived life, mourning the dreams, goals, and experiences you sacrificed to keep others comfortable. You may realize that you chose careers, relationships, and paths based on others' needs rather than your own. Yet Jung saw this grief as necessary in healing, the psyche's way of honoring what was lost while making space for what now wants to emerge. The empath who attains this sovereignty discovers something remarkable. Their capacity for genuine compassion actually expands. When you are no longer draining yourself for others, you have more to give from a place of abundance. Jung observed that free empaths become conscious healers, people who help others from wholeness rather than woundedness. They no longer need to fix others to feel valuable, nor do they need to be needed. This creates what Jung called liberated love, affection without strings, help that doesn't foster dependency, presence that requires no reciprocity. Jung's final message for empaths is clear. Your journey is not about becoming less sensitive. It's about becoming consciously sensitive. It's about reclaiming your empathy as a gift you choose to offer rather than a debt you feel compelled to pay. Yet Jung also cautioned about what he called the integration temptation, the pull to revert to old patterns when others resist your new boundaries. He understood that true growth requires staying committed to your truth, even when external pressure urges you to return to your former self. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." For empaths, this means acknowledging that your true self encompasses both your capacity for compassion and your right to exist fully, without apology. If you've realized your empathy is a choice, not an obligation, comment, "I choose when to care," and that makes it more powerful. Jung observed that the integrated empath becomes a beacon for others, not through self-sacrifice, but through self-realization. You demonstrate what it looks like to be sensitive and strong, caring yet boundaried, empathic yet whole. The freedom to choose when and how to care is the ultimate gift Jung offered empaths. It transforms sensitivity from a vulnerability that others exploit into a strength you consciously wield. The empath is essentially the child who was never allowed to be selfish. But now you understand what Jung truly meant. Your empathy is not a flaw, it is unfinished development. You learn to use your sensitivity as a survival tool, and eventually as a conscious choice. Jung showed that the path forward is not about reducing empathy, it's about becoming consciously empathic. It's about reclaiming what he called your sacred selfishness, the healthy ego strength that supports authentic relationships and genuine service. You don't have to choose between caring for others and caring for yourself. Jung's individuation process guides you to integrate both into psychological wholeness. The child who was never allowed to be selfish can grow into an adult who chooses when and how to give their gifts. Your sensitivity is a superpower, but only when it comes from strength rather than survival, choice rather than compulsion, wholeness rather than woundedness. Jung spent his life demonstrating that the most empathic people are those who have learned to empathize with themselves first. The next time someone tells you that you're too sensitive or selfish, remember Jung's wisdom. You are not too much for this world. You are simply finally becoming enough for yourself. And the transformation from unconscious empathy to conscious empathy is exactly what the world needs. Not more people who give until they break, but more who recognize their worth and give from overflow. If you want to explore more of Jung's insights into psychological transformation, check out my video, Why You Lost Interest in Your Hobbies. After Awakening, where we dive into how consciousness development reshapes your relationship with activities and interests. The empath who was never allowed to be selfish is finally free to choose. And the choice to love yourself as much as you love others is the most generous gift you can offer a world that desperately needs whole, conscious, integrated people. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.